on my
Right.
camera is like, the hell?
We are live on the Mission Mediation podcast. Welcome, everyone. The sun has just risen where Jim and John are coming to you from live, and the sun has set a long time ago back here in India, in Delhi. But this is, of course, season two of the Mission Mediation podcast. I'm Jonathan, your host, and I'm so excited to be bringing you this episode. We've got two lovely gentlemen who've been talking to you about going down memory lane in terms of media.com and its rich history in terms of how it has shaped the evolution of mediation, the profession and the practice over the last 30 years. So we can't wait to dive into that for sure in the next few minutes. Wherever you're joining us from, in between the time zones, use the chat option on LinkedIn. Say hi. Jim and John and myself would love to hear from you. If you have questions on the way, if you have thoughts, if you don't agree with what we're saying, you don't have to always agree with what we're saying, and you can always drop in your opinion, and we'd be happy to address that. So I know that a lot of people who have written into me, Jim, John, that they're excited to be listening to you today after a long time. So hopefully we'll get some live comments coming in as well. But if not, of course, a lot of people watching this on record. Um, the Mission Mediation podcast now it's in its second year. It's hosted by the Pact, which is of course a mediation service provider and a training academy. And we have had the privilege of working with the mediation community in India and acquainting thousands of lawyers to understand what their role is in the mediation space. But today's conversation is a very exciting one for me. There's so much going on in the world today. For those of you who don't know Jim and John, it seems like a Jim and John. I wanted to call it the Jim, John, and Joe show here. It would have been a nice one. But yeah, I stuck to my big old long name. But yeah, they're the founding figures of media.com. Of course, both professors who teach in various organizations. I can't get through their CVs because that's going to take a lot of time by itself. But I'm going to come into small things I'm going to cue you up with, some of your historical past while we talk about certain things about the future as well. Gentlemen, if I may, I want to actually spend a few seconds just also remembering a dear friend, if I may, because we've not had this podcast episode for quite some time. And I want to dedicate this one to Susan Terry, who left us just a few weeks ago. She was a teacher of mine. I took the reflective practice class with her, and she was always a bundle of energy, a lot of fun, and she always had that humorous side to her. I was wondering whether you want to say a quick word to Susan. I'm sure she's listening to us from somewhere.
She of course worked with a good friend Michael Lang in founding the Reflective Practice Institute, which really took mediation levels down in terms of depth and understanding, and will continue as an ongoing fixture. You can see into the future. So what a nice thing for her and Michael to have that legacy of gifting that institute to the field.
Absolutely. John?
I didn't know Susan that well. I'm not sure where she fit into our history. I knew of her, and I certainly heard many good things of her through Michael, but didn't know her well.
Yeah, I mean, she had a tremendous impact on the people she met, and I think a quick dedication. But I'm sure in Susan's own words, she would want us to get on with it now and speak about media.com. So let's get there. Hi and bye to Susan, and of course we miss her in the mediation space. All right, so let's get to media.com. 3 decades of being the lighthouse for mediators across the world. Mediators who have been looking out not just for literature, but also for a space to base themselves, almost like an online office space for themselves, to put themselves out in the world, create that visibility, create that branding for themselves. So you'll have had a tremendous impact on all that. I want to get into media.com, Jim and John, but I also want to acknowledge the world that we live in today, the world that we live and operate professionally and personally, and there's so much going on as we speak. There is a high stake mediation taking place in Pakistan, which hopefully will lead to something positive, right? And hopefully it will be the end to this a war that shouldn't have happened, I guess. But I'll raise the context to why I'm bringing this up, because I've spent the last 10 years kind of dedicating myself to the field of conflict resolution. But whenever there's news of war or just distress and hate speech and fake news, and the way people just get on with each other without really trying to understand the other perspective, I feel quite discouraged to be in the space talking about peace and mediation and conflict resolution. I want to throw it out to both of you. How do you feel? How do you feel being in a space of conflict resolution and mediation when there's so much of this going on around us?
John and I had some nice chats on prior to this call, and we were talking about how, first of all, the digital development even began before Mediate.com. For me and perhaps John, all the way back in 1987, 88 with ConflictNet. And I'll let John talk in more detail about ConflictNet. He was the founder, and the IGC, the Institute for Global Communications, and APC. But the thing we were talking about is that the ultimate roots of ConflictNet and conflict resolution online go all the way back to the Vietnam War. And I'll let John speak to that. I'll also mention very quickly, there was a time during the George W. Bush administration where they refused to talk with Iran. Mm-hmm. And remarkably, Mediate.com led a petition drive to encourage politicians to at least talk, okay? And, now we have the current situation, which, believe me, we're not proud of in any way. But if we've proven anything, it's that progress is not a straight line. And also that the conflict resolution field can be an active participant in elevating and improving the conversation. So, John, why don't you go back just a little bit to the roots there?
Sure. I had the good fortune of living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and through various phases of development of ConflictNet, in fact, the basics of it was I was introduced to the Institute for Global Communications, IGC. And IGC originally started with PeaceNet. Mark Graham was an anti-war Vietnam activist, and he linked up with a bunch of geeks. They were pulling stuff out of, we accused them of dumpster diving. They were pulling servers and technology out of dumpsters as the turnover was happening in Palo Alto area there. And what flashed for me as we're just talking now was the idea of actually citizen diplomacy. One of the things that we were doing as a group, that IGC became the Association for Progressive Communications, and we had created nodes. This is kind of pre-internet. We created nodes around the world, and we had a node that was in and around Tiananmen Square, and the technicians had figured out, they had cut down the communications in China, but we had figured out how to get text to fax. So there were still fax machines that they had left open, and we started flooding Tiananmen Square with fax information about what the rest of the world was seeing from their perspective. So it was a real interesting citizen diplomacy kind of phenomena, which gives me some hope that may be what we are confronted with in the next round of turmoil that we're in right now. That we're actually, the internet has the potential of really getting our message across and letting them know. All of our No Kings marches are, they show up on the internet all over the place. We get a sense that things are happening there, and we're hopeful because of the media impact that we have right now.
there's no question that the internet has expedited social and political development. Quick illustration: in the States, gay marriage and also the legalization of marijuana, for example, were discussions that took place online and evolved over a year or two, rather than decades. And I think right now we're seeing the internet as a major player. You screw up and it's going to really blow up in your face here. There's a heightened level of accountability. There's also some kind of sadness. For example, in Iran, I think that they restrict the population, from accessing the internet, which is additional testimony to the power. Now, so I just want to validate that there have been difficult times in the past, and there will be in the future. And the internet's a real player, as is the conflict resolution community. We don't want to sit in our hands and bite our tongue. We have a role to play here, which is, I think, empowered participant involvement and optimized problem solving. It's the stuff that we pride ourselves in being able to support. We now, John, I know, agrees with this. We want to bring it to the broader community, not only through elevated, improved mediation, but through leadership, through education, through community building. That's the real story, is the extent to which mediation best practices supporting participant empowerment and optimized problem solving can now be shared with our societies and with the world. We can't tolerate, we can't tolerate the dysfunction. If anything, we know, though, progress is not a straight line. It tends to be pendular, and we're going through a difficult phase right now. However, it's a remarkable phase with AI. I just wanted to give one thing. John started ConflictNet signing individuals up one by one by one. There was no internet. So they were signing on to communicate with other people in the network. And the Academy of Family Mediators, which I was managing at the time, was a meaningful player there. As folks grew and the snowball grew, as we got closer to the birth of Mediate.com, January 1 of 1996, one of the things that was very effective for us is we could give them email addresses at Mediate.com. At this point, getting your own domain was too complex and not streamlined, et cetera. So people were attracted to the brand name. And then the big thing that led to the founding of Mediate.com was the graphical internet, the websites. Everybody we knew, every mediator, every mediation organization would need a website. And our first big product was the dynamic website system, where we were able to assist non-technicians, mediators who were great, not thrilled about embracing technology. We were able to assist them to manage their own information on a daily basis. And then being in the Mediate.com directory and associated with the evolving content of Mediate.com gave everybody a broader, deeper presence, and the field a deeper presence on the internet. So fascinating, these things used to evolve over years. Now they're evolving over months. Okay.
I want to come back to the mediation directory, and I have a whole section for that, but I want to really get down to the value it brought to the global community. But I think what both of you just said, that your look at conflict as an opportunity, more than a situation of panic. And I think that has been the philosophy and mantra for conflict.net in the 1980s, and then of course media.com in 1996 when it was founded. But this is such an amazing journey, and I was speaking to John earlier, Jim, about I've been in the space for a decade now, and there are times when I feel, is it worth it? Right? Is it worth the struggle? Because you see how and you mentioned that, you said during the war, when in the 80s, I guess this is when the US was refusing to talk to Iran, I think, during that time, and you all put out that pledge to say, get them to just talk. We have a similar situation with our neighbors here in India, and where there is this thing where we're just not going to talk to you. You guys are difficult people. You label it whatever you want. We're just not going to talk to you. Right? And I don't think that leads into anything, right? And this refusal to talk, this refusal to dialogue in difficult conversations, right, is, I think, it's something I want to talk to you guys about, I think, if you don't mind. And especially to John, because you've had a master's in behavioral psychology before you got into conflict resolution. How do you see things? Have they changed in terms of how people approach dialogue over the last 3-4 decades? In terms of, because there's a lot of technology that's come in, right? And I speak to both psychologists and conflict resolution professionals now and say, what is the future? Because today everyone's comfortable speaking over the internet, right? So I can probably address a difficult conversation with you over this call. But what if I meet you in person at a conference or at a coffee shop? Do you think I can still do that in person? Do I have the social skills to do that? Yeah. So just some thoughts, John, on this.
Yeah. So I was pretty naive when I first jumped into this. I had no clue about what online really meant, but I got into it. And IGC gave me the platform that I needed to be out there. And what was initially fascinating was that because I went out there with the name ConflictNet, the netizens, the people who were out there, who I had no idea they were out there, they thought that I was coming into their space to help them resolve what were known back then as flame wars. And so I had no clue what a flame war was. And so, the psychologist in me started going, well, what is this? I need to find out what this whole thing is going on. And I realized there was these really nasty interactions. And it was because they were not in a face-to-face. They would never have said that if they were in the room with the other person, but they said that and they kept it going, kept things going. And it was like, wow, what an amazing phenomena. And now I look back, I look at where we're at now, and we don't have flame wars anymore. We don't have people going off on each other because they've got this security of being, in a different space, in a different area. And I think the internet over the years has become hard to think of it, but has become more of a civilized space. I still see a lot of incivility, but compared to the flame wars era, it was
worse.
It
was worse back then.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, John, I think one of the reasons for the conflict was it was purely textual. Okay. So that's all we had were words, and there wasn't nuance, there wasn't empathy, there wasn't intonation and the like. Let's fast forward now. First of all, our ability to meet like this is a miracle. It's a miracle that we can, at what cost? Maybe free or very close to that. Is pretty mind-boggling. And the online doesn't preclude the face-to-face. It can be both. In fact, I would say even if you get together, you still want to do the online as capably as possible. But one of the things I've been really struck by over the years is people really don't need to prevail in conflict as if it's a battle and there's going to be a winner and a loser. But the one thing that I know is true is they're unwilling to be the loser. They don't want to be the fool. They don't want to be the chump. Okay. So as we've gotten ever richer communications online, we're doing better in terms of helping people to, in a thoughtful, informed way, better resolve their disputes. And we would be remiss not to notice the impact of COVID. All right. So with COVID, overnight, at least in the US, all mediation was online. It was literally illegal to get together face to face. Okay. Well, remarkably, we had done enough development over the years on the front end of mediation and the back end of mediation that for us having Zoom as a surrogate meeting space really filled a void. There was a mass training event because not only did the professionals need to learn it, but the marketplace, the folks were all learning Zoom so they could communicate with their own families because they couldn't travel and the like. So you had this mass training event, everything moves online. And to this day in the US now, between 75 and 80% of mediations are exclusively online. Okay. 25% will still get together, again, wanting to do the online well as well. And so this is unbelievable when we think about scaling mediation and making it available and affordable to people. You layer in AI, and we have a bright future because now you can make better informed decisions and get along better with our help as mediators online.
What do you think has changed that mindset? You said, of course, during COVID, we were kind of forced to go indoors. We were forced to kind of explore the ways of, figuring out how to resolve disputes, how to make things work more generally. And it was that compulsion in some ways that, we had at least in India, I think mediation really took off during that phase in 2020, 2022, because every day, but there were like half a dozen webinars on mediation and ODR, and it was too much to even consume at one point of time. It was just too much, and yet we had the time for it because we were at home. We had nothing else to do in some ways. We were saving on all the travel time, and we obviously had work to do, but we were saving on all the travel time. So, do you think, like from a human psychology perspective, especially in the ODR space, that if it's kind of made, I don't know, I don't use the word mandatory, but something on the lines of really pushing it out there, nudging it more intensely to kind of get it into the systems for people to embrace it more. Do you see that? Do you feel like that's the right strategy? Was that used back there in the US to kind of get people to really, if you're saying that 80% of the mediations now are online, now that speaks a lot about trust. That speaks a lot about psychological safety to be doing that online, and that speaks a lot about the confidence that you have in both the neutral and also in the process. So what has kind of given the people there that much confidence and all that?
To be honest with you, people are ever more busy. The convenience of being able to move a conflict resolution forward online. In the old days, we had like a hearings mentality. If we were going to mediate, we scheduled a day or 4 hours or at least 2 hours. And it was inconvenient. We'd have to drive, we'd park, we'd pay, get daycare, take off work, etc. Now, to consider the possibility of mediation, we might do an introductory session for 15 or 30 minutes online. So it's not dislocating. And while the biggest challenge online is developing a rapport relationship with the folks, I'll note back in the day when we had 2, 4, 8 hours scheduled, there was a lot of caucusing, meeting with people individually that would go on. People would be out caucus. They'd be in a separate room wondering why the mediator's spending more time with this other one. When we're online, scheduling is so nimble that I no longer caucus as part of a joint meeting. I say, hey, we need to discuss that. Let me schedule a half hour with each of you this afternoon. And so it's much more tailored to what needs to get done. And we don't need to belabor things if we need to get more information, et cetera. So it's the flexibility, it's the convenience, it's the accessibility, it's the affordability, it's the ability to put one's toe in the water and get a little feel for what it might be like, whether I could trust this mediator. But ultimately, the convenience, the scalability, the affordability, and something, if it's not working for someone, guess what? they leave or they get a different mediator. So it's this dexterity. If you compare it, for example, with a court system or with formal administrative agency hearings, it's our nimbleness, our flexibility. There's a saying, the most flexible component of the system controls the system. And I think in the world of dispute resolution, that's mediation.
I think one of the other factors that happened at that time, the COVID transition, if we can label it as such, was that the courts were totally unprepared for it. The courts were historically backed up. And all of a sudden, they were not just backed up, but they were closed down. They didn't have a way of dealing with anything. And I'm sure that people confronted with court dates and court interactions all of a sudden had that option disappear for them. I suspect many of them said, well, then let's try mediation. And I think the mediators were out there saying, well, yeah, let's go. We know how to do this. And they made that quick transition into Zoom, which became a predominant platform. And everybody else was learning it also, as we were saying, to stay in touch with their family. So we had a motivated user to get into the technology and learn how to use it and be comfortable with it. And we had a system that was dysfunctional in the moment. And it took them a long time to start figuring out, well, how does this old court all of a sudden start dealing with online interactions with, how do we do our business as a court online? And they took them quite a while to get it figured out. Well, mediation stepped in and filled the gap, in my belief.
Well, two things are simultaneously true. Everything you said about mediation, but as you said, John, courts were forced to go online. Yeah. That was the only way they could deliver their services also. And so there's been a sea change since COVID in courts and agencies' willingness to consider comprehensive online dispute resolution systems, of which mediation is a major component. All right. And I highlight this right now. Literally this week, ODR.com, a derivative of Mediate.com, reached an agreement with the Superior Court of Los Angeles, the largest court in America, and Stanford Law School, to most capably bring the Superior Court's business online, including online mediation. All right. So that tells you how far we've come. We've come, John, from signing up individuals for email addresses with ConflictNet and Mediate.com to now having comprehensive online platforms that integrate automation, AI, and the human touch. And this is something I hope we'll get around to, is because while we're becoming ever more technical, paradoxically, the thing that it really allows an online platform to not just serve some, but to serve all, is the ever-present availability of human assistance. Okay. The online environment can do a lot of things for us, but what makes it work for everybody, and we need systems that work for everybody when they're public systems. The thing that makes it work is that there's always a little button on the screen, I need human help, and that we're as responsive as possible to that. Initially, with what I call mediation information specialists. Okay, before a mediator is assigned, and then once a mediator is selected and accepted, that would be where the human button would go to. But intriguingly, to be most effective online, we need to perpetuate the human touch. John and I have talked a lot about this. That's the magic secret sauce.
We also need that little link that says, I am not a robot, because even if you ask for a human touch, most people can't tell the difference between a real human and a robot. And in the age of AI, that's become even more so. I mean, we're going to find it difficult to tell, oh, that's an AI-driven individual talking to me in that nice accent and cute voice, and that I can't tell. The Turing test is over. We can't tell the difference anymore.
Well, for anyone joining live or watching this on record, the three of us are not AI at all. This is Jim Elmed and John Healy, of course, the founding figures of Media.com and, of course, Conflict.net. We are on the Mission Mediation podcast. This is such interesting stuff. And congratulations on that very, very, very massive deal there with the court system in LA. But I'm quite curious to understand that. What has gained that trust? Because, India has seen, and got some good friends here in the ODR space doing some fantastic work, right? And every jurisdiction has its own journey, and we're making some really good inroads. But I think there's a lot to learn as well, in terms of building the trust with the judiciary. Of course, when you talk disputes, we end up talking about the judiciary. Of course, there's a lot of push for pre-litigation mediation and pre-arbitration mediation and just conflict resolution and conflict de-escalation, where you don't have to really even talk about the courts. But let's talk about the courts. We're talking about dispute resolution. We're talking about ODR. What has kind of gained the trust? You talk about the human touch, and it's kind of ironic to speak about it in a virtual setting. So how do you achieve that? Like, what are if you had to kind of say, what are the top 5 factors that ODR platforms need to kind of really, let's not say top 5, I put it on the spot, like the top key elements that ODR platforms need to kind of consider to really build that trust, that human trust with both the code systems and also with the clients, because both are important stakeholders.
I'll add 2 words: convenience and effectiveness. All right. Let's take as an example the EEOC in America, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Lots of cases, legal cases. Folks typically are represented by legal counsel in mediations, arbitrations. There's a large volume of these cases. For a time, again, 100% were online. But now that COVID if you will, passed at least somewhat, we find 80% of participants and their representational lawyers prefer the online environment. And I absolutely believe the issues are convenience and effectiveness. And so let me highlight a really key piece. Online, we have a palette for communications: text, image, audio, video, either real time or asynchronous. So, for example, email is a good example of asynchronous. I get it to you and you get to think about it, chew on it before you respond. Well, in conflict, people make their best decisions, I find, when there is asynchrony, when there's time for them to mull. They're at their worst in real time under the gaze of the other side. Right? But that as we bring up possibilities, having breaks in the conversation, being able to send them an email with some questions for them perhaps to think about, maybe even to do a little AI homework about possibilities. This is, I think, one of the key factors, is taking some of the time pressure. When we had court mediation programs, you show up on a day, you're often, in a stark room with hard chairs and maybe a judge or who knows who's helping you. The ability of the online discussion to fit itself to the things that need to be resolved, to make the progress that can be made. But when it gets difficult, let's push pause. Let's come up with our next things to think about. We want to assist you to be at your best in thinking these through. Do some homework. Let's reconvene tomorrow at 2. So I'm finding that there's a choreography of communication where we take advantage of the variety of modalities, both real time and asynchronous. And this is what assists people to be comfortable and at their best. And the super cool thing about mediation is nothing we do changes the fact that it's voluntary, it's confidential, the parties retain complete decision-making power. Even if they're doing AI homework or the mediator, the parties are always in control. Nothing will change that. And that gives them a safety and security in that process. It's the only process that actually tries to help people reach best agreements, not just barely sufficient agreements, to call off the war. So I'm
That's
just
yeah.
really struck by the convenience, the effectiveness, the flexibility of the online environment are really helping our mediation process move forward.
That's a very interesting point to bring in there. And I want to bring in John very quickly. But before that, I just want to kind of call this out in terms of what you highlighted there in terms of taking a break, and it's very, I think, especially from a cultural context for us here in India and also in most, I think, of South Asia and Southeast Asia, for us, decision making is not as, I would say, independent as maybe the West, right? It's a collectivist society. It's not an individualist society like the West. And so for us, decision making, even though we're capable, we're very smart and intelligent and capable, we have all the resources possible next to us in a mediation room. We might even have a battery of lawyers sitting with us. But we always want someone to say, "Hey, you're doing the right thing. I think you're doing the right thing." You want to have a lobby backing you up. You want to get all the advice you have, especially because India is also some of the biggest corporations and companies are family run, and so there are multiple stakeholders who you will not ever see in the mediation room. They're the ones whispering things into your ears, right? And so you highlighted the fact that you could take a break, you can go back, you can kind of have those conversations and come back.
For me, a face-saving rationale is a precondition for agreement. Okay, people need to be able to share with themselves and with supporting others. Everybody in mediation is reporting to other people. Okay,
yeah.
And so when the people say, "Well, why did you reach this agreement?" they can't say, "I don't know." They need to be able to identify the benefits of making the decision they did. And I find this to be facilitated by the online environment. I'm able to have as deep, as long individual discussions with parties as I want, okay, in a caucus context online, without rubbing the other party the wrong way, because I'm going to talk with them just as long as is helpful as well. But I talk about identifying the string of pearls. What are the benefits you get? An imperfect agreement, we understand that. But what are the benefits you get? And now let's compare that with what things will be like if we don't resolve it. Okay. And, the BATNA, the WATNA, the MALATNA, for the alternatives to reaching agreement. And I just find the dexterity of the online environment, being able sometimes to talk to the full group, sometimes talk to them respectively on an as helpful basis, and not have a hearings mentality, we need to get it done today.
Right.
But rather a problem solving mentality of let's be sure we're doing the best we can possibly do. And from my perspective, it's perfectly fine for people to not agree, because there's often not enough on the table to have that be their best decision. But I absolutely want them to be aware what is the best agreement that is available to you in mediation, and to fully understand that, compare it to the options. I think the mediation effort owes that to people. What is the best agreement that could be available to you today, should you choose to go with it?
Yeah, and that's once again, you're talking about the advantages. The fact that this seems like complete common sense to take this online, give people that psychological space. John, I want to bring you in here because you're not a lawyer by profession or by training, I believe. And from a behavioral psychologist perspective, right? How important is that psychological space? Because especially in say employment disputes or community disputes, or even sometimes commercial disputes, right? People, human beings, get remain connected with spaces, with physical spaces that have been pain points or traumatic for them in terms of the disputes that they have experienced. And sometimes mediating online, being in the comforts of your own space, like where you are right now, that's your comfort zone, John. I'm sure, Jim, where you are, that's your comfort zone. And you look very relaxed, right? You look like you can be talking for the next 10 hours and you have no comfortable being honest about what you want to say, right? Yeah, I just want to bring in your thoughts on that, John, from a non-lawyer perspective. Why is psychological safety so important in online?
Well, I've been retired, and I take my retirement seriously. I really don't. This is a rare phenomena, actually. But in my retirement, I decided I really needed intellectual stimulation, and so I picked up on this artificial intelligence thing, and I decided, okay, I want to read everything I can and really think about this and stimulate my brain that way, and so trying to stay on top of it. And the big question for me as I'm studying AI and its evolution into society is, and my interaction with mediation, I keep asking myself, what is entirely unique to the humanity that when you bring, what is it that you bring as a mediator? Because I'm pretty confident that a very significant amount of disputes will be able to be resolved with AI. Without human intervention whatsoever, we're going to see AI mediators out there resolving disputes. No question in my mind that's going to happen. The question comes up is, what is the advantage of having a real human involved? What does a real human bring to the equation? I used to think, well, empathy, but you talk to an AI bot for a while, and pretty soon you realize they're really good at empathy. They're really, really good at empathy. And so empathy is not what you bring. What is that human characteristic that you bring that is important to that? And I do believe that there is an importance to a real human intervention. But as mediators, we really need to understand that. And it's not just saying, yeah, that's a good way to go. I think you're making a smart move here. The feedback from other humans, it's just not enough. It seems like we have to have something else that the human brings to the equation that the AI can't bring to the equation. And I think that's really challenging for mediators to delve into their own practice and their own presentation and their own interventions to understand that which AI can't do. And I don't think we've sufficiently grappled with that question. What is it that we bring to the equation?
That's an interesting one about empathy. I like what you say there. If I may comment, I think the difference between, a human mediator and an AI mediator is that a human mediator or human beings, even if they're not mediators, in a dispute resolution space, the difference I think between us and AI will be that we want to be empathetic, but we know we can't always be empathetic, and we will be imperfect, right? And I guess that would be the defining factor, the imperfection of the human being, that we want to be as much as we can, but we just can't because we're human and we
So
are
we
real.
have the capacity to be tentative.
Yes.
AI may not be, I don't know, maybe AI is not tentative. AI is convinced, So
Isn't it?
I don't know. I don't know what you should do. You might want to think about this, you might want to think about that, but I don't think AI does that.
Yeah. One other thing I'll mention, I work mostly in the family and workplace corporate space where there's not just a dispute. There's a historic relationship. There's how the folks are getting along today. And there's any desire for a future relationship, or do we actually need these people to be able to work together. And so in terms of the relational dimension and what the different parties need at different times, I think there's a human discretionary ability that AI may not be able to fully detect. And there's other things also, which are what the people do not come to us at their best, from my perspective. And so what can we do to assist them each respectively to in fact be at their best? It's going to create the best agreement. And what can we support them doing on their own? Do they have the ability to collaborate? Could we give them an assignment or two to brainstorm? And then what are their interests in the future as well? So those human relational dimensions of the conflict, not just the substantive merits of the dispute, I think are really important. I'll mention one other thing, Jonathan, and that is, a mediator who has a lot of experience, I think will tend to be more trusted. They kind of understand the space. What I would always find that people would lean forward and pay the most attention when I would sometimes get to a point of saying, would you like to hear some approaches that have worked for others in this kind of situation? They want that, and they want that because they don't need to prevail.
Yeah.
They just want to be smart, and things that have worked for others. And this is another great thing that AI can help us with. But it's just very fascinating, I think, that as we have increasing automation and increasing involvement of AI, I think it's the human touch that is the secret sauce that binds it all together. And I think we're making a mistake as mediators to resist technology, I don't even know why we call it AI. It seems like a pejorative, isn't it just information, and shouldn't you welcome all information but trust yourself ultimately as to whether it's relevant and correct for you,
Right.
So that's my view of it, is that even calling it AI has been in part a defensive mode of somehow lessening the value. It's remarkably valuable. You get it in 30 seconds and it helps your consideration.
And it's
interesting for all those people who kind of find it difficult to accept. You've been Googling for the last 25 years. You got all the information from there. You never said anything about it then. And now suddenly, because you see the word artificial before intelligence, it's getting you all, but thanks for getting in those comments there, Ali and Patrick, wherever you're joining us from. If anyone's joining us live still, please drop in those comments. Tell us what do you feel about what we're discussing, especially we were meant to be celebrating media.com, but as you can see, we have been tempted to get in the space of AI and ODR, and of course that is something we totally enjoy. I want to quickly come back to the media.com journey, but one last question on AI, John and Jim, if you don't mind, because you all have been visionaries in the space. You all saw this before the internet even took shape, as you say, before there were the websites, and it was all about emails and really hard work, manual stuff to get people into a space of putting themselves out there as mediators, especially in the community mediation space. AI is going to take over at some stage. AI is going to really enhance the mediation practice or the dispute resolution practice. What's your advice to ODR platforms around the world who are going to adopt this? Where would you suggest and recommend them to draw the line in terms of how much and do they adopt, and how do they get into the space?
Well, I mean, we can talk about what a mediator should and shouldn't do in the use of AI, but for me, the reality is that the parties are going to come to the session armed with their AI. I mean, they're going to have their own bots working in the background, or they may well bring their AI to the table. There's no reason why I can't imagine going into a mediation as a party and not having my tablet right there with my bot listening and, quite frankly, responding. to what the negotiations are going on. So do as mediators, do we say, no, you can't do that? Do we tell them, you can't use AI in this process? It's going to be at the table. There's no two ways about it, So
I'll tell you why. I'm so tempted to bring this up. I'm so sorry, but so I'll give an example. So I was speaking to a good friend of mine a couple of weeks ago. We had a misunderstanding about something that we were working on together, and I was obviously broaching the topic with the person and addressing it with the person. And I noticed the responses that were coming through to me on WhatsApp were constructed very differently. And I know this person for the last 10 years, right? So I know how this person speaks. I know how this person used to text me on WhatsApp earlier, right? I know that, the mannerisms, the punctuation, the spelling mistakes, all that kind of stuff. And I'm now seeing this all constructed so beautifully. And I'm like, there is surely an element of AI here. And I'll be honest with you, and I want to admit it, it frustrated me. It got me upset. It got me a bit angry about the fact that why is this person not being honest and genuine about communicating with me? Why is this person using help? And because I'm trying to address the situation and this person's speaking to me almost like a robot, right? And it kind of frustrated me. So I want to bring this up here. This is a very important point, and we're talking about bringing AI into conflict resolution. Jim.
Yeah. So I've been interacting with a childhood friend, and we're playing around with writing a co-biography through the use of AI, and we are on the phone a lot. And yep. I will raise a hypothetical question, and he's really fast on the keyboard. I raise a hypothetical question, and boom, he's raised the question with his bot. And he's straightforward, and he's not denying his use. He said, well, my bot just said that, answered your question this way. And I went, Jesus. I'm having a three-way conversation because he's fluidly going out there and asking the hypothetical question that I raised and giving me, a whole bunch of information and a few other options that we could explore if we so choose. It's just, it's really quite, it's very different than anything we've ever done before. It's a quantum leap from what we've been up to previously.
Yeah, and AI is everywhere. Okay, it's wanting to write our emails these days. It's at the top of our Google searches, etc. Let me very quickly highlight for the group. I categorize AI into two categories: administrative, ministerial, so scheduling, payment, Grammarly, the front end and the back end administrative, and contrast that with substantive consideration of the issues in dispute. And the key there, the key for administrative is preventing the sharing of personal identifying information. Okay, that's critical. With all of our administrative things, we don't want to have the parties' private information getting into the large language model. So that's key. With regard to the consideration of substantive issues, the key issue is transparency. Okay, so if we're a mediator who doesn't believe in AI, just be transparent and say that. If you use it, share with the parties how you use it, and you may well become a bit of a coach for them, because we can help them do better prompting based on all of their interest, the interest framed positively. Asking what might work in the plural, asking what's worked for others in the plural. We never ask for a single answer. But I want to highlight this piece because I think it's right on the forefront of where we are. ICODER, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, came out with ODR standards about 3 years ago. And literally last week, they came up with an 11-page document on guidelines for the interpretation of the ODR standards. And they talk, for example, about competency. Okay. Mediators need to get competent, whatever your choices are about use or non-use. The marketplace includes AI. The parties are coming to you with it. You need to be competent in having what I call the AI discussion with that. Okay. Second thing is we can't rely on traditional mechanisms for confidentiality. There's a lot of litigation now about lawyer-client privilege and is Claude a person? That literally is in a recent. So it's really elevated the importance of contractual confidentiality, embracing the consideration of AI content. And in fact, if you look within the last 2 weeks, I published a short article on how we can widen the contractual confidentiality understanding to include AI substantive consideration in the mediation. But here's the key one. The iCoder standards talk about comparable technology for all participants. Okay. They would not favor, one party participating on phone and the other participating, with video platform, unless that was by agreement of the parties and everybody was informed, etc. But they generally talk about equality in terms of technical platforms, the level playing field technologically for all parties. And for me, the interesting question is, does this include access to AI? Are we as an individual mediator or as a mediation program building in to our level playing field provided technology access to AI? I think that's the exact threshold of where we're at right now. And of course, if we're going to do it, let's make sure it's protected communications and a part of the mediation confidentiality.
This inspires me that this conversation today could be. This seems like a part one.
Yeah.
We're nearing the 1 hour mark, and I almost feel like calling it. This is part one of this conversation because it seems like we got a dozen or 2 dozen more to go. We're so tempted to dive deep into it. But Jim, John, if you don't mind, I want to wrestle back time here. Keep AI aside. I'm sure we're coming back to AI, and if not in a few weeks' time, in a couple of months, we'll bring in some more folks. We'll bring in our good friend Colin Rule as well. I think there's so much more that we can talk about this. But I want to go down memory lane with you guys for 10 minutes, if you don't mind. Right?
Sure.
1980s, 1990s, John, Jim, when you decided to start Media.com, what was it like? Did you guys meet over a coffee? What are the first things you all said to each other? Do you remember that? I mean, what was going on in your minds when you said let's kickstart Media.com?
We were a remote team to begin with. I mean,
Okay.
we never shared office ever. He was in Eugene and I was in I was in Berkeley, across the bay from San Francisco.
You have never shared office for the last 30 years, is that right?
Never.
Wow. There you go. The power of collaboration online.
Yeah. It was pretty astounding. I mean, we would meet literally at conferences. I'd fly into Houston, he'd fly into Houston, we'd find the hotel, and that would be our meeting. And we had, we padded into the schedule time for actual meetings, organizational meetings to happen. So yeah, we were never there. It was Yahoo Instant Messaging that was the real-time component. We would all have a little indicator up there. We could tell who was online at any given time. And so I could see Jim was still working and it was 10 o'clock at night. And I'm going, what are you still doing? Or our technology officer, Carol, she'd be up in the middle of the night working away. And then we'd have a conversation in the middle of the night. So it was really a virtual team phenomena.
There were a few visits. I always enjoyed going down to Berkeley And I can remember, we got started when it was like dual floppy drive computers. When we got our first 10 megabyte hard drive, that was a big deal. And I very specifically remember John one day, we knew text, okay, email changed my life administratively. But then John says one day, look at this. And a picture painted itself in ever so slowly. And I images now, huh? He goes, yep. And I go, well, this changes everything. And of course, for the porn industry, it sure did. Okay. Then, about a year later, John says, listen to this. And he goes ahead and he plays an audio. What was it? Real Player, I think, was the first platform. And, listen to this. And oh my God, audio now. This changes everything. And a year or two later, John says, watch this video. And it was choppy and it was, blah, 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 but it was video. Okay. All of those things have now refined into things being just about as good as being there. I
was so fortunate to be living in the Bay Area. Silicon Valley was just going crazy. And we were downtown San Francisco and in an area that was called Multimedia Gulch. And Wired Magazine, their offices were down the street from us. And the square called South Park was just alive with all these technologists walking around eating burritos, talking about IP addresses and the latest thises and that. So I was really at the point of all of this new stuff coming at me. I mean, I would have to be asleep not to have come up with a lot of ideas because I was being bombarded with new ideas from every direction. It was a very dynamic time to watch that internet go. And, I learned how to write HTML. I was actually writing the code behind websites. I couldn't even begin to imagine doing that now. And I had never, another disclaimer, I'm not only not a lawyer, but I'm not a technologist either. I have never taken a course in technology. I've never taken a computer class ever. But I was there kind of immersed in this stuff coming at me. And I saw how it could be applied. And that was kind of my forte, is that, okay, we can use this to do that, and it was like, we can use websites to replace brochures. Jim and I were reflecting recently about the phenomena of desktop publishing and how desktop publishing gave everybody brochures. So they were able to make brochures, really cool brochures. I can remember making really cool brochures with desktop publishing technology. But then you had a brochure. Then you had the dilemma, how do you distribute that? Most mediators had boxes of brochures in their closet, and they didn't know quite what to do with it. They brought them to a conference, but they gave them out to all the other mediators. And the mediators would look at them, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that to my brochure, next time I publish them. But it was, it was at the point that I realized, okay, a website is a brochure. And you don't have to worry about how you distribute it. You have to worry about how it, we discovered meta tags. And we had a great time with meta tags. And there's some great historic stories about meta tags, but we discovered meta tags in search. Well, we were way ahead of search engine optimizations, SEOs, hadn't even come along. We didn't know that term at all, but we understood that people were using Google, and we wanted to come up whenever they did a search on anything related to conflict. We wanted to come up as that thing. And so we started doing a back-end load in the meta tags field. And in the early days, you could click on a website and it would show you the code behind the website. You could see all the code, and part of the code was these meta tag things. and Jim will remember this story. My sister put my name into a search engine, and she immediately called me up and said, "So why is it that when I put your name in, what appears to be a competitor comes up
There you go.
over there? It's not mediate.com, it's somebody else." And I went, "Oh, that's really interesting." And so I immediately jumped out to this website and looked at their meta tags and realized that they had done a complete copy and paste of all of the meta tags on our website and dropped it into their website and used it as their meta tags. What they didn't realize is at the very end of the meta tags, we put in Jim Malamed and John Healy. So, of course, when you search on John Healy, you'd get this other website to come up. We confronted him and said, "Cease and desist, this has got to stop immediately." But it was one of those steps. I mean, it seems historically ludicrous that they would do things like that, that even they had the capacity to do things like that back in those days. But it was, compared to what we've got now, it was pretty crude. I mean, it was rough around the edges, to say the least. But it was a dynamic and fun time. Boy, it was crazy times.
You seem like you're geeking about it even now, 30 years, 40 years from when you actually went through all this. But I want to come quickly to this because I want to actually take a couple of steps back with both of you, because even before you thought of starting mediate.com or conflict.net, what drove you to conflict resolution, right? And maybe I'll start with Jim on this. So you've been a professor, an adjunct professor both at the University of Oregon and Pepperdine University for nearly 3 decades now. Of course, a lawyer at the Oregon State Bar as well for nearly 4 decades. Was it like just an offshoot from law for you, Jim, or how did you get into conflict resolution?
I worked for a couple of years in a small firm that had the public defender contract for the city of Eugene, and I was low man on the totem pole. So I'm going every day to the jail for in custody arraignments. And
Right.
after about a year of that, I just felt like a cog in a system, and there was no creativity. There was very little humanity, etc. Turns out the one guy who had been mediating in Eugene decided to become a salmon fisherman in Alaska. And he had been practicing with a psychologist woman who was now looking for a male lawyer partner. And I did my first 10 or 12 mediations with her, which was fantastic because she got me really comfortable with conflict in the room. There can be that, but also good progress as
Right.
well. And it was just, it really boomed, to be honest with you, in 80. I started mediating in 83, 85. We founded Oregon Mediation Association. 87, I got hired by Academy of Family Mediators. They hired me because I had mastered desktop publishing of a newsletter and a conference program. They said, "Wow, we're doing mimeography still, can you?" And in 6 years at the Academy, very much because of ConflictNet, we went from, in 1987, 807 members. 6 years later, 3,200 members. And it was because we mastered online communications. We got our members' email, there was bulletin board, you had archive of historic discussions and policy discussions. And then, of course, everything changed when the internet went commercial, .com websites. And John and I made one bet, which was every mediator and every mediation organization is going to need a website. And we were right about that. And we provided them with this dynamic website technology that allowed them to manage their own information rather than being reliant on others to do it. So that was really the thing that got us going. I want to highlight one more issue: content. All right. All of our learning about meta tags and SEO has kind of gone out the window now with AI. I care far more how AI reads mediate.com and us personally than I do about Google, historic Google SEO. And I just want to highlight for the listeners, this is the best reason for you to write about your practice, write about issues in the field. Get out there. Send the articles to mediate.com. Send the articles to other places. Get published. That's how you will best differentiate yourself from the wannabes in the field. So take your involvement in the field seriously. Write about your practice. Get out there. The AI engines will find you.
Because the client and the counsel want to know their mediator. They want to know more about you.
Yep.
If you want to be out there in that place. So once again, thanks once again for showing us what it was and what it meant in terms of just building the directory and also building the blog to kind of really enhance the profile of mediators. John, over to you. You were in the Air Force for 4 years as a technical surgeon before you got into conflict resolution, part of the Vietnam War. Of course, what inspired you there? Were those days? Did you experience something during those days that kind of inspired you to get into conflict resolution?
Boy, I mean, those experiences, and I'm now reflecting on them more and more. Those years in a military hospital, taking care of Vietnam vets coming back, mud still not dry on their boots, and they were in my operating room in California. It was hard. It just didn't. I mean, it traumatized me pretty severely. I have a weird sense of life and death and a weird sense of humor around those issues, but I wish I could say that I was driven by some deep philosophical drive, but the reality wasn't quite that clear cut. I knew I hated war. I knew that I was, after I got out, I had a hard time even going to demonstrations. It brought up so much stuff for me, and I knew I needed to be there, but I just couldn't do it. I just didn't have it in me to get out there and do it. And so I kind of, in many ways just shut down about the whole conflict world out there. I was very fortunate to have had an education that emphasized problem solving. And as I kept going on through my career, I went from being in surgery and working in surgery, and then I went into the educational academia, and I, got into neurosciences because I had worked with the brain in neurosurgery. And so I had that neurosurgical stuff, but then I went into school and I continued my education along that way. And then my academic career started falling apart because enrollment was declining, taxes were going away, GIs were through their GI Bill educational experience. My professor taught me plumbing, so I learned how to plumb, and he was a problem-solving guy. I mean, he taught me problem solving. He taught classes in creative problem solving, and he taught plumbing in a perspective of a problem-solving approach to things. So I had that piece of it there, but then he was no longer doing it, and I didn't want to get a plumber's license and become a union plumber. That was So I had this hodgepodge of background, and it was like I didn't know what to do with it. It was really tough to figure out how to make a living, literally, to do that. And I had a couple of good mentors that said, you might look into this field of conflict resolution. You've got a lot of, interesting background, medical and construction and all of that through problem solving. You might want to look at mediation. And it was like, that's interesting. I never even heard about it before. And then I plugged into the Berkeley Berkeley Dispute Resolution Services, and it was just beginning, and I was on the team that started that up. As I was taking classes in I can think of his first name, Bill Lincoln. I took his classes and learned how to be a mediator. He insisted on negotiation first. And so I learned to negotiate, or learn more about how to negotiate. And then it was rolling in. Well, I was looking at community mediation and realizing that I needed forms and I needed to, generate these different things. And I knew that there were, I think there were like 600 community mediation programs happening in the United States at that time. I thought, well, they're confronted with the same things. They need forms. They need all of this information, and I knew that right across the bay from me, Community Boards was kind of the premier community mediation program. And I knew those guys over there. And I called them up and said, do you have a modem? And they said, yeah, but we don't know how to use it. I said, okay. And this is an addition to the story. I actually went over to San Francisco. The story goes better that I just had them send the files, but I actually went over there and I explained to them how their modem worked and connected it to their computer and had them dial up the number that they needed to do. And that was kind of my realization that I needed it. They had it. I could get it by telecommunications. And I realized that all of these other programs throughout the country were in the same situation. They needed forms. They needed to communicate with their community boards partner across the bay. And I had enough experience with telecommunications. I was working for a consulting firm, and they handed me this luggable computer with a 300 baud internal modem that I had to slip into place and then plug my phone into the side of my computer and get this 300 baud modem, and I'd send my reports off to Mountain View. And where was I going with that? I realized that we had shared needs, and that a network that was able to share information was a valuable service that I could fit into the mediation world, be part of it, and be, from a really selfish standpoint, I was at this crux of all kinds of mediation. People were sending me more and more and more, and I was posting them out to mediate.com or ConflictNet. And I was the hub of all of this thing, which was a glorious place to be. I was getting an education, whether I liked it or not, I was getting an education. I had to read all these things before I posted them to mediate.com. And so I saw that thing, and that's what grew into mediate.com from that standpoint.
Talk about open source in the 1990s. Gents, I want to quickly thanks for once again sharing that with us, John. I mean, how the dots connected right from trying to figure out how this all made sense for you, the different kind of jobs and I would say possibilities that you were exploring there as a career options, and how it finally all connected. But we don't have enough time to talk about the success of Mediate.com, because there's plenty over the last 3 decades. And if anyone's watching in here, all you got to do is type the simple. It's a very, very smart move to have a website as the name directly. So it's Mediate.com. That's all you got to type in, and you'll get all the information you can about the success of Mediate.com. I'm quite interested in the failure of it, because I think the failures is what define you and what takes you to the next step. So we got 5 minutes more. I'm just trying to figure out, do you remember some of your biggest missteps there? Things that you might have felt like didn't work out?
First, I want to thank John for revising history there. I always thought the field was dependent on your not wanting to pay the toll at the Bay Bridge, that was the driving force. But now that I understand you were willing to do that at least once, things have changed. I got three in quotes bombs for you, but actually they're learning experiences. Back in 1990, okay, so this is ConflictNet's going vibrant. I developed a program called Agree, which was a really pretty damn capable framing of the needed discussions to, in fact, assist people to get agreement. The failure of this project, however, was this was before networks. So for participants to work on the Agree program, they had to share the same computer and keyboard. Okay, so that was kind of a little bit of a fatal move. We were before our time, but the essential framing of the process, and in fact, the artwork that I had developed, Mediator Max, I'll share with you at some point, was done in 1990. Second failure was something called Instant Assist. Okay, sounds good, instantassist.com. And this was based on audio. This was when you had customer relations management programs, CRM programs. And suddenly this could be our case management system, and people could dial in and get some instant conflict resolution support. And John talked about the intercom. We would know people on our panel that were on the computer, and somebody would call in. We could associate them with somebody who was on the intercom, and they could get services. Well, it just became too much management. And in fact, the biggest failure was that people would call in with major problems. They would talk to somebody in our office who would say, let me put you on hold for a moment. They would come and talk to everybody else in the office about how they could best assist this person. And it really got in the way of us accomplishing our work. And again, it was kind of an idea before its time, but it was beyond text. It was beyond text, and it was the audio phone system. And then,
when was this, Tim? When about was this, would you say? When about was this, would you say, in the early 90s? Or just
Instant Assist would have been 1992. Okay. And then finally, I'll mention our good friend, the boy wonder, Colin Rule, who was our first employee at Mediate.com and who worked with us for a couple of years. He then founded the first online dispute resolution platform called Online Resolution. And in fact, our lead programmer, Carol, provided the first platform, which was called Meeting Space. And I could give you history on that. But again, it was all text. Okay. It was just during all text. And so, one of the things we've learned is just text, just audio aren't sufficient. We need all the modalities of communication, again, both real time and asynchronous. And now having those tools in our hands, we can really create miracles online. So 3 different investments of a lot of money that kind of blew up in our faces because they were platforms before their time. But having the full modality of communications, we're there.
Yeah. I think one of our challenges and, sometimes failures was being on the bleeding edge instead of on the leading edge. We were just out there ahead of time. And I reflect back on the early days. ConflictNet was a nonprofit organization. So I was always out there seeking funding, trying to, get money so that I could pay myself. So I didn't have to go crawling under houses fixing plumbing, which is what I supported the early days of ConflictNet with. There was a woman that was early on, Diana Gould. She was my partner when we first started ConflictNet and was really instrumental in introducing me to the Institute for Global Communications, which was fun. but we had to raise our own money in order to pay ourselves. And we used to joke, we had an office in San Francisco, and across the street was a little liquor store, and we would have a Tuesday afternoon funding thing where we'd call them our funding proposals. We'd go buy lottery tickets, and we'd specify, okay, these lottery tickets, if they win, are to support ConflictNet. So that was our early funding proposals.
Gambled on the career move there.
John, you may remember it was Diana who introduced us to each other.
Yeah.
At the NCPCR conference, North American Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution in Montreal in March of 1988. And my connection to Diana was I taught high school for a year after college, and I coached soccer, and she was on my soccer team. And she ended up working with John and introduced the two of us to each other in Montreal.
38 years ago. So, wow, it's been a long journey. This has been a very long conversation as well. I know we can go on for so many hours more. And as I said, this is just part one. But one final question. I haven't
even gotten to my notes.
I'm glad you didn't have that coffee this morning, John, or maybe you would have got to the notes faster. But one last question, a quick one, and I like putting this one on the spot for you guys. Is there something? It's been 38 years since you guys met, 30 years of media.com, almost 40 years of since conflict.net was started. Was it? Yeah, conflict.net was started. But is there anything you regret not doing? Because I guess the regrets always things you wish you had done and you didn't do it, because failures teach you to move on. Failures teach you to kind of
I wish I had bought a lot more domain names. There was a time when I could have gotten car.com and house.com and anything.com, and it didn't cost anything, but I sat there with a good friend and saying, what are these good for? I wish I'd have bought a lot more. I would be a .com millionaire, but I didn't quite make that one.
We debated whether we should get Mediation or Mediate.com. The smart answer, of course, would have been both and more, for sure. Probably the smartest decision we ever made was to not get outside funding.
Yes.
Because when the .com boom happened, we were able to keep going by our bootstraps and just incrementally built the business, kind of an old-fashioned, paradoxically, an old-fashioned approach allowed us to stay in business when 95% of the .coms went out of business. So
we took some angel funding, family and friends funding, but beyond that, it was total bootstrap. And I think that was a very good decision because, venture capital was so fickle in those days, but they were all over us. They wanted to know what we were doing. And, I was having meetings with venture capitalists pretty frequently for a while. And then I just decided I don't want to talk to them anymore. The answer is no matter what they say. I'm not taking their venture capital. No.
So no regrets now, John, even now, 30 years from then?
No.
It is notable. I don't know if people know this, but the American Arbitration Association, which we wish had a bit of a different name, they purchased Mediate.com and ODR.com about a year and a half ago. Their only acquisition in 100 years of operation. And so I think John feels this way, kind of validating for the decades of work. And the cool thing now is Colin's running the show, Colin Rule. And when they acquired us, we had like 9 employees total. Now there's 31 for ODR and Mediate.com, half of them in India, where we're doing most of our development these days. So I find it validating that not only have we created something, but it has every chance of continuing to grow and positively influence the conflict resolution market.
I think this is the right time to kind of wrap up the conversation with that note. I think the way you kind of stitch it all in, the journey that has been for the last 30 years and how it finally all came together for you, I think, and for you to experience that in your lifetime, I think to see it all come to fruition and see how you started and bootstrapping, and it's still relevant advice to any startups today who are getting into the conflict resolution space, because it's a very passionate project, right? And you want to keep it close to your heart as much as possible until the final finished product is ready to give out there. It's been a privilege to be journeying with you and celebrating this 30 years. I know that we could have gone on for 30 hours or probably 30 days speaking about it, but John and Jim, thank you so much for being on the Mission Mediation podcast. I will cherish this conversation. I think if I could summarize it in one line is that change is an opportunity, and you guys took it decades ago. And I think that's relevant advice even today. And I will hold that in my heart. So thank you so much once again for being part of the Mission Mediation podcast.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome. Yes.
Thanks.